somebody's predicting he's coming back on a certain date, and I've heard those in my life.
Years ago, I knew a fellow that had a real bad car accident. He was like 22. He wrapped his car around a tree. Okay, so they brought him in and they thought he was going to die. And I knew him, I guess, about 10 years later, but he'd always told the story. And that was when he wasn't popular. And I was like, oh, okay, But he heard and he saw everything that was going on and could hear it. Wow. So I do know one person that actually did happen to.
Yeah. Oh, you hear about it often.
Now you hear about it
often.
Okay.
All right.
The ones that die, you don't hear about it. But it probably happens all the time.
I want to go home and have a night nurse. Mr. Platt.
No, there's no reason to do that.
My grandson wanted to have some kind of game about with a bunch of
You're going and you're going to crosses and you're all in it.
Don't get down
You can't even crosses. I don't know how to handle that.
We want to look at one whole category of alternative religion experience that has been popularized in the last several years. And it often goes under this term neo-pagan or just plain pagan. Occasionally you'll see the word heathen used. Both of them are old words. They both may come from a similar origin to talk about, to designate an outsider group or a group considered less than. There are some that think that the word pagan may have had as one of its original meanings the hick, the hillbilly, the country boy, and the word heathen may have the same similar background. There's discussion about what its meaning is. An alternative to the word pagan is that it was a word that had the idea of civilian as opposed to military, and that Christians saw themselves as soldiers of the Christ, and therefore the people who weren't Christians weren't in the military, they were civilians, they weren't in the army. There's a third, I can't even remember now, origin postulated for the word pagan.
I always thought it was that they didn't have a religion.
Well, that's how it, yeah, that's how it was generally used, most popularly used in Western experience, was to refer to those non-Christian religions, or if you were a little more liberal, non-Christian, non-Jewish, non-Islamic, i.e. non-Abrahamic. It's a really old word. The Christians started using it probably as early as the 3rd and 4th century to designate these unchristian people. And the neo has been added to it in the modern age because this is a new paganism. And that's because what's happened is that people in opposition mainly to Christianity, for one reason or another, have adopted one or more of these old religion groups. Here we go. Here's the Druid religion from the Celtics, the pre-Christian, the Hellenistic Roman religion, the Egyptian religion. What other tradition would you suspect could become a popular source of spiritual ideas besides Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Germanic tribes of ancient Europe, the Celts, the Norse? Who else? One real obvious one. The Native Americans.
Well, didn't they do a lot like with the alchemy and stuff like that?
Yeah, there are all kinds of features to that, and those are what that first slide you saw had to do with. And the reason why these practices have come back, because of course in Western civilization, they were significantly outlawed, oppressed by the church. They were heathen, pagan ideas, ancient superstitions. And so the church officially, in spite of the fact that it sometimes adopted their symbolisms, oppressed them. And so basically, they mostly disappeared. There would be the academics that would keep track and find the old documents and preserve the ideas and so forth. And occasionally you would find a group of people back in the hills somewhere who had not been significantly converted to Christian faith. But in most of Europe, the Christian faith became overwhelmingly the prevailing, in most cases even, a state religion. And so most of this stuff disappeared, except in the underground, in the superstitions that people still held on to, old wives' tales that they would still tell, that kind of thing. So in the popular religion, you still had elements of these kinds of things. The blessings and the curses and the astrology and magic of various kinds would still persist, but oftentimes that it was separated now from whatever old religious background it had. We still put the mustard on, or put the rabbit's hair, or carry his foot, or all kinds of things that we did. We often were not even aware of what religious source that had in our antiquity, but we still had it. In the modern last 100, 150 years, again, mainly because of reaction to the hegemony of Christianity, which was often not very kind, there has been this reaction that feels like, well, they had some pretty good ideas. Now, what major current movement do we have in culture that would easily align itself with some of these ancient religions? A major cultural development, relatively, really modern, really hyped, increasingly by certain groups.
Well, it's all this new age stuff with this astrology. And
Yeah, there's some of that, but there's one that's even far more comprehensively, enthusiastically promoted in a totally secular way. Pardon? No, but it's one of the ecologies. Environmentalism.
Environmentalism?
Yeah, because environmentalism is concerned about Mother Nature, the world. And some of these old religions were very earth-centered. The only calendar that they were concerned with, because there was no historical background to the calendar, like the Jewish calendar or the Christian calendar. All the calendar days of any significant importance were all rooted in natural phenomena. The phases of the moon, the movement of the sun across the equator and to the equinoxes on both sides, the cycle of farming or of herding or even of hunting, where everything happened pretty much the same time of the year in much the same way. And so it was organically connected to the physical earth. And then those that went past that into the heavens, and you have the whole art of astrology, which again you see is very nature-oriented. And for the ancients, the really ancients, there was not even the imagination that that involved a vast universe. This was something that happened in the heavens that were just a little higher up than we could reach or jump. And so
I wonder where they took that astrology. I understand that, but I wonder when they decided to, like, you're born in July, and so I'm going to tell you about you. Where did they ever come to that point, I wonder?
well, that goes all the way back,
It goes back all the way,
clear into the ancient Near East even.
so they wouldn't even tell you, so it's like a personality.
Yeah. The info, and you see you have all the astral factors involved. So there's not only the stars, quote, way out there, at least a little bit further than, but there's the moon and the sun.
I just didn't realize it was that far.
Yeah.
I thought maybe they did like the calendar or the weather, but I didn't know they were looking at each other, like when you were born in July, so you like this or that, which now we've developed that.
I'm not sure when all those details come in, but the idea that that has impact. And so under what quote sign you were born, under what quote sign you reached a certain age, what sign you got was in vogue during the time you got married, when your child was born. All of these natural features were incorporated into these religions to varying degrees and varying places. And in the ancient world, many of those were then, of course, assigned a god who was either that natural phenomenon or at least the representative or the controller of it. Some of these North European religions didn't always assign multiple deities to all this kinds of thing. They were even almost like the true animist of the primitive religion, where everything has its spirit. Of course, the Greeks weren't far from that when Plato proposed that everything has an ideal that's behind it, within it, beyond it, which wasn't material, but was real.
Well, it's like in the 70s, you know, that new age really came in.
Yes.
And that's what you're talking about.
And some of those, various groups of those that organized, reached back into various elements of this stuff.
Yeah,
And
but you could meet somebody and say, what's your sign?
yes.
The first thing, you know what your name was?
What was the national anthem of the New Age movement?
I don't know.
Aquarius.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the dawning of the New Age.
Well, the only thing I remember about
Yeah.
that point is when Prince Charles said he was talking to his plane.
Yeah,
And nothing wrote that.
yeah, yeah. And this is part of that natural connection you see, where and see that has a strong attraction to people who feel like we humans have exploited the planet and we've ruined it and poisoned it and we've done all these bad, and we really need to get back in sync with nature. And among some of those who are very, very active environmentalists, when you get to know them, when you probe them a little bit, you'll discover that they also are pretty involved in some nature religious movement or another. Now, a lot of them, of course, are just outright atheistic secularists, but there are those who have made a real connection between their spirituality and their environmentalism because they see them as connected.
Well, that's what we're seeing now, like everybody's on, you know, this electric car and stuff.
Yeah.
So that one messed up the earth. So
Yeah.
we're seeing all of that right
Yeah.
now, but
And
they don't have a name.
So we'll mess up the earth to make an electric car. Do you have any idea what the carbon cost of the battery for an electric car is?
But see, they don't get it.
What mining has to occur, what processing has to occur to create the elements for that battery. And that's just part of the issue. Okay, so we have this fairly common term, and some of these various groups in here will even use the word pagan themselves. They've accepted that as a term, a spiritual or religious designation that fits who they are as opposed to Christians.
Because pagan, I thought, yeah, I know it's a long time ago, but like they're earthly. They're
Some of them were.
They're not Christians or anything
Yeah.
like that. They're more earth.
And
So they're pagans.
And some of them had, were not near as earth-oriented because they were into the astrology or into the gods, and you're blending off into theosophy and Schwaborgian and Rosicrucian, where you have this spiritual world that is more important than this physical world. So you get this whole mix. And there are those, of course, of those groups who would not accept what they see as a pejorative designation as pagan. They think their religion is as authentic and as valuable as yours is. These ain't, pardon?
Is somebody cleaning?
I don't know. Or is it somebody out back behind their house? It could be. Somebody running the vacuum cleaner? Yeah, okay. We don't mind. The various practices of these groups are usually pejoratively grouped under the category of the occult, which basically simply means secret or hidden. And it involves all the kinds of practices and activities involved in understanding or controlling. And so you have all of the various magics, which are frequently divided into the black magic and the white magic by some groups. Some groups don't see that distinction.
What's the difference?
The difference is white magic is good, black magic is evil. And we'll see a specific application of that down the line. There are groups who would say that there's nothing wrong with magic. To a great degree, remember, magic was simply the science of the ancient world. If you have the right words or the right process, you'll get the same result. So if you know the name of the God, the right name, know how to say it exactly, and know exactly the right way to ask the question, you can get the God to tell you whatever it is you want him to tell you. Reveal it to you. That's why it's called divination, from the divine. And there were all kinds of procedures for doing that in various cultures, of being able to find out what is the God's understanding of whatever the situation is or is going to be. Astrology is, to a great extent, a process of divination. If you know exactly all the astral elements, influences that are operative at this specific time, then you have a great deal of insight into what is or what's going to happen.
Sounds like witchcraft.
It is. Witchcraft is simply one of the terms applied to this process of either knowing or accomplishing. You either find out something or you make something happen. And for the ancients, as I said, it was basically a matter of science. If you knew exactly the right compounds to put together in the right amount, under the right conditions, then you would always get the same result. It didn't always work out, but even in science, you see, once I got my theory and I started my experiments, I frequently found out that my experiments didn't always end up the way that they should have, according to my theory. And so eventually I had to change my theory. And so the better you were at this, any one of these arts, was based on how many times you got the result that you proclaimed. And how poor you were at it depended upon how much your prophecies came true or your incantations had the right development. If all the people you blessed got married to the person you blessed them for, then you had a pretty good practice. If they didn't, well, then you were going to have to find a new job. And depending on the culture, there were all kinds of procedures for this. There were all kinds of experts in any one of these endeavors. So the medicine man of the American Indian was a worker of these one or more of these methods. He would either find out something for you or he would help something happen for you.
Okay, basically the same thing as today.
Yes,
Why people go and see the tarot card.
right, yeah. It's the same, that read their horoscope for the day.
But you know, like reading horoscope, it seems like that's not something that it's so like, they don't do that much anymore, they're not really for fun. But I remember, you know, different presidents' wives would do that.
Yes.
Nancy Reagan.
Yes.
And the woman that was her astrologist was Jean Dixon. And she even supposedly told Nancy not to let Reagan go out, you know, in his car that day because it's going to be bad. Well, he did, he got shot.
Yeah,
But, so, I mean, but-
yeah, same kind of thing.
But I'm just saying, it's, today they don't seem like they put too much into them, but I have heard that other people like, I don't know, I think Hillary Clinton and some of
There are a whole lot of people
them still have.
who still do this. And the practitioners of all of these arts, you see, are either absolute charlatans or they really are believers. They really think they have this skill.
Well, remember, like, there was a lady in Brownsville, and in Mexico, I think they practiced that a lot, because what happened was, you probably saw this doctor's wife, they were both Hispanic, she had a daughter, and the daughter met this boy, and they really liked each other and everything. And so she was thinking, oh, my daughter's so happy, she's only like 19, but they're gonna get married. Well, anyway, the boy dropped the girl and didn't marry. Well, that was probably about 20 years ago, because it made all over the radio stations and TV stations and all that. What she had done, her mother, who's a believer in all of this, she would go to the local psychic. Now, there's a psychic like a McDonald's on every corner.
Yes.
In Brownsville. So she would go to this one that she really liked. So she would give her a lot of money, and she would give her all these spells and stuff. You know?
Yeah.
Well, the problem is, on her own, she killed the kid, you know, and so they called her in, and I don't know if they did anything to the psychic or not. I think she's still.
Well, the psychic wasn't very good, because the psychic should have been able to do that without the lady having to do a thing.
I really don't think all of them.
Well, and see, part of what lies at the background of this is what their view of the spirit world is, and to what degree spirits can be involved in this. And you have all the varieties of different spirits here, and you see Christians who early developed their theology around the single God, but he had a very, very strong spiritual disembodied opponent, Satan, the devil, and each of them had their own emissaries, i.e. angels, good ones and bad ones. You had no difficulty at all in the Christian faith developing a very strong theology to explain all of these incredible powers being exercised by all of this magic, because they were being used by the demons. And so, you know, you could easily believe in all of this magic, because it wasn't just mechanical, either in concert with it or behind it or totally operative within it were these spiritual forces. And this develops to such a significant degree in the Christian faith that today you have this whole category in modern Christianity of spiritual warfare, which takes very seriously the Ephesians 6 passage, that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of all different kinds and categories and qualities, and they're real. And there has developed in certain Christian circles a very, very realistic element in this struggle. And you can read their material. The demons, they have been confronted by the specific names of these demons and their ability to conquer them, because now they know their name, and so they can stick Jesus on them specifically. And there are incredible stories of churches that are literally failing, have for a generation, 2 generations at this location, and they finally are able to discover the demonic spirit behind this failure, and with the focused prayer, fasting, they're able to exorcise him, and now great revival breaks out in exactly the place that had never occurred before. The demon possession of the New Testament is understood to be very real and very alive and very extensive.
That's why they said that.
Yes. But these other religious groups, you see, simply draw into that same mythology of the spirit world, and can add that then to all of these other things. And depending upon their particular persuasion, they can lift up a god of the Druids, a god of the Celts, a god of the Egyptians, and fly under his name. Others, not concerned about that at all. So here you have the divination, sorcery, fortune telling in all kinds of ways. You have the whole spiritism connection of the god, of the spirits of the dead. Remember, that was the spiritism of the 1800s that we looked at. The big movement here in this country was the one that was contacting the dead. Theosophy went into the larger spirit world of the great masters of previous eons and all that kind of stuff. Then you have the magic or the witchcraft, where you have influence upon the individual and influence upon the events, and all of the various factors that are involved in that. And then, depending upon the particular group, where they focus these various elements, and so whether what would traditionally be considered religious activities, events, festivals, services, how much of that they may or may not have. And some, like Wicca, have regular activities. The medium of the seance may not do anything except their times with trying to contact the dead. And they don't have another time where they sing songs or they study or they worship in any kind of a practice. It's just the activity they carry on.
I was getting here during this Sunday, I was looking through my paper, and sometimes I look at the obituaries. It's morbid, but anyway, and there was the lady's picture there, and she looked to be probably in her early 50s. So I started reading. I thought, well, goodness, she was a nun, you know, and she had been one for like 25 years. And then she went on and got some more degrees, and then she became a psychologist and everything. And she was in this group that was called Women of Wisdom. And I thought, Women of Wisdom, I wonder what that is. I've never heard of that. And so I looked it up. Well, come to find out, as I'm scrolling down, I see Wicca, and I see all this stuff, and they're witches. And they meet all the time, and you become joined. And I'm like, Women of Wisdom, they're a bunch of witches. And I thought, how do you go from that to a psychologist to a witch?
Well, that's an easy step. That's an easy step.
Three-step program.
Yeah, 3-step program.
I don't know. I'm I'm being funny, but I thought that was weird.
And the reality is that some of these groups that emerge are the product of people who grew up in a Christian environment.
And it happens a lot.
Yes,
It happens a lot.
yeah. People, the man who developed the religion department at the University of Houston 40 years ago or so, told me one time in a conversation that in the university setting, he obviously had often opportunities to interface with atheists and agnostics and discuss that with these students and meet some of these people. And he said, I personally have never met a strong atheist or agnostic that didn't grow up in a Christian home. And his view was, his assessment was, what happens is that all of these people were never given the teaching that allowed them to grow up with God. They grew up emotionally, intellectually, maybe even some degrees spiritually, but their God was still the God of a child. The God they had, that they learned about, that they experienced as a child. And that God couldn't answer the issues that they were experiencing as a teenager, young adult, parent, intellectual, academic, college teacher, student, and then teacher. The God of their childhood couldn't answer those questions, those issues.
I brought that issue up to a pastor about having a baptism school before they get baptized, and not to let young kids get baptized because they're not old enough to know exactly what it is. So I suggested for them to assign a senior Christian, where they could condition this child, throughout her life there at school until she got old enough.
Yeah, the ancient Christians, 2nd century Christians, actually did that. There was almost, in many groups, there was almost a 2-year training, teaching period between the time you said you wanted to become a Christian and they let you be baptized to become a Christian.
It's not something that you just,
and of course, see, missionaries struggle with that all the time. How soon do they feel like this convert really understands the difference between their worldview and whatever the religious background they've grown up in and the Christian faith into which they are coming? But of course, the side issue that you have to ask is, why wouldn't that have not been true in the 1st century? Why wouldn't that have been true in the ministry of James and Peter and Paul? And so the issue is, the real issue comes down to, on which side of baptism do you understand that you've got a whole lot more work to do? And so when a person becomes a Christian, the issue may not be, what all do they know now? But how well are you going to teach them from now on? And not just teach them intellectually, but teach them holistically, so they really grow in the faith. They really follow Jesus. And you're going to get me off on one of my hobby horses. Because you see, I think this is one of the places where Christianity failed abysmally. Because what we very early started doing was trying to clarify exactly doctrinally and ethically all the decisions you should make and all the things you should understand exactly the way you should understand them. And then we just told them all they had to do was do it this way and say it this way.
I was talking to this man, and he said that he had been baptized, and I asked him how old he was, and he said he was 14.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I said, why did you get baptized at the age of 14? He said, well, the preacher was up there preaching, and everybody was going to the front, and he said, the preacher said, you better hope that Jesus doesn't come tonight because you're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
That's a lot of references.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it scares the real kids and old ones too.
Yeah.
I
And
think that's why they say they grow into it.
Yeah.
You stay with it, and what they're really trying to say is they're getting closer to God. I think Jesus is, he knows, and so he tries to help us know more about him. But yeah, I think that,
we clearly don't do anywhere near a good enough job teaching people to follow Jesus and build them into an understanding of who he is and what he's like and what standards and values that involves, so that they more and more instinctively respond in a positive way. And that involves a far broader liberty than we've ever been willing to grant people, so that they can follow Jesus in ways that we can't even imagine possible.
Right.
But they can do it,
Right.
and we let them do it. We encourage them to do it. We pray for them. We support their doing it, in the full knowledge that we couldn't go that way. That for us it would be a trap. We'd walk ourselves right off a cliff because the challenges that involve, the temptations that involve are just things that we can't deal with. That we'd be like an alcoholic who's going with somebody who always buys beer. And we know we can't do that, but he can. And we let him. We're able to let him and not judge him and not be tempted by his example, because we're not following him, we're following Jesus. And we know that that person, that Sunday school teacher, that elder, that pastor isn't Jesus. And I'm listening to Jesus. And if this pastor doesn't help me hear Jesus, I don't care what he says. I'm not concerned about what he says. I want to know what Jesus said.
Yeah, it's not a ticket out of hell. It's your learning your best friend.
But
so many churches do say that.
it's I have a son who was crushed at a Christian camp, who hears this preacher tell all these young teens that they need to make this kind of decision. They need to do it tonight, because last year at camp, there was this boy who said he wanted to become a Christian, but he didn't want to be baptized. He wanted to be baptized at his church. And on the way home from camp, he was killed in a car wreck.
No, that is not a minister.
Of course. That's terrible, you know?
Okay, so are you going to get baptized tonight? Are you going to get in the car?
You know?
Well, that's the part problem because some of these kids are hearing this, and even young adults, and
Yeah,
it's staring at them, and they're thinking.
yeah. And I often raise the question, can a child, even a teenager, really commit to follow Jesus because they aren't themselves yet?
No, I don't think that.
See?
You know,
They're not even a person yet.
and there's even grown-ups that
Yeah.
fall into that category.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they need to learn about him and read the Bible, what he says and everything, and
You know,
closer, but you don't.
And,
Like he said, tell somebody you're gonna get killed in Colorado. You go to hell.
And that was, of course, the clear implication, was this kid was lost because he didn't get baptized.
And so we don't read that.
And my son is sitting there, hearing that, and he's saying, that's crazy. That there's no way that could possibly be true.
But see, your son, because of his upbringing,
Well, he couldn't rationalize it very well because that still haunts him to this day.
really,
That still haunts him to this day. And that whole group of churches, you know, he can't even think about relating, belonging to any of those churches like that because that still haunts him.
because you have people that say, you know what, I got baptized too young.
Oh,
I
yeah,
didn't know what I was doing.
yeah,
I didn't know what I was getting into.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm the way that I am.
yeah. And so we clearly we don't do a good enough job. Okay, this is this whole category of these non-Christian faiths who draw on, who develop, who grow out of, in many cases, deliberately, intentionally, openly connect with one of these ancient religious ideas. And then the reality, of course, is that because these are ancient religions, and in the Western world, in our languages, they were pretty suppressed for better than 1,000 years, most of them. There's not a whole lot of information around about them. And so what happens is these groups often just eclectically pull together what they want, and they virtually invent their own group. And that's what you have with Wicca. So let me see if I can, wait, I don't want to do that. I want to just cancel that down. We'll use this one. This is one of the modern where's what I want? Here we go. Is that too big? Almost. Let's see. Nope, that gets most of it. This is one of the modern, quote, witchcraft or witch groups. It's the best known. It's pretty widely dispersed. They are recognized by the military. And so you can be a Wicca priestess in the Army, just like the Pratt Baptist chaplain. They're pretty earth-oriented. The modern movement grows out of these developments in England, but you notice you're in the 19th and the 20th centuries. When people begin to write about these ideas, and you don't really get any development of it until after World War II, when you're getting in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, all these New Age people and all these newer religion groups and the Eastern mysticism coming in a whole variety of ways. And you get this development by Gardner. And notice he's not only looking at the European traditions, but the Eastern and Asian traditions. And he publishes this Witchcraft Today. And they found a group, a coven, they call them, again, picking up on all this old terminology. And they develop all of this stuff, and this particular group is heavily oriented to feminism. The chief deity is a goddess. They are fundamentally very benign. You notice it's not till 1968 that you get a recognized, organized group in this country, but it's not long until you have a bunch of them. They're not all of the same persuasion. They have their denominations, just like the Christian faith. There are two major distinctions depending on where they drew their information from. Are they mainly Germanic, Northern European? Do they reach back into ancient Middle East, Greek, and Rome? And you get all kinds of offshoot groups that aren't very big, singular groups. There may only be one of this particular kind of a thing. There's currently 2 organized federations of them. And then here's their teaching. The spirit is eminent and transcendent. That's good Christian doctrine. God is both present everywhere, and yet he's in heaven. He's totally somewhere else. For variety here, of course, there's some of these people who are very nature-oriented, and so they can be very materialistic. I mean, not in terms of things, but in believing that there isn't much spirit. They can be very atheistic. But this is the only world we got, and so we got to get connected with it. Those who have some deity have various expressions of that, various figures for that, various images for that. Like the Middle Eastern, every living thing has spirit or is spirit, and therefore is connected with every other part of spirit. The earth connection for many of them is not material because they believe in spirit. And so they even see this world as the globe, the dirt, the sky, the water, as expression of, or in that Greek manner, the material side of the ideal that's spirit. And so you want to have real harmony. This is their basic motto: if it harm none, do what you want. This is the old English expression. If it does not hurt, then do it if you want to. Everything's a matter of individual insight. The major Wicca group, the organized group, have specific rituals that are regularly held. They use a whole variety of activities, much like many churches: music, dance, food, or readings. They celebrate various things, especially birth and marriage. Anybody know what hand fasting is? That's trial marriage. Trial marriage. Yeah. You become engaged and you live together for a year and a day in the most popular tradition. And the day after you've lived together for a year and a day, then you decide, okay, do we want to keep on doing this with each other? Or do we want to call it quits and go find somebody else? Yeah, yeah.
But most of the time, it's not just a year.
No, but this is an old European tradition, goes way back to pre-Christian days, and it was actually preserved in some Christian groups clear through the Middle Ages.
Yeah, before you got married, you lived together.
The betrothal was not a chaperone engagement. The betrothal was a period of time that you intimately lived together, or at least intimately met together on numerous occasions. At the end of which, you would decide whether you were going to get married or not.
Well, I have learned something.
Now, what would be the logical?
Because I thought back in the 60s, everybody was going to go, you know, where, because they were all doing that.
No.
They've been doing that for 300
Yeah.
years.
What's the logical, valid reason for doing that? There are two. If you don't have arranged marriages, then there's the value of the two people knowing each other well enough to know whether they want to keep on doing this for another 25, 30, 50 years.
Well, nowadays, it's just on this.
Yeah, but there's a far more practical reason for having hand fasting or a similar process. Very obvious reason. Why are they getting married in the first place?
Make a family.
To do what?
To make a family.
And how do you make a family?
Well, you would, of course, work together and all that.
No, what makes a family? Why is it called in the church tradition, why is it called matrimony?
Well, you're leaving your parents, that's for sure.
Yeah, but why is it called matrimony? What is a mater?
Gloria, answer that.
What is a mater? That's the Latin for mother. The reason you get married is to have children.
You think they're having children with this year?
She would get pregnant. Maybe. That's the reason.
They didn't have shotguns,
No, but why would you get married? Why would you get married if you couldn't have children?
Oh,
That's hard to swallow.
so if you don't get pregnant by a kid, then you drop you.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
they can drop you. See? Yeah.
Any teenagers hear this?
Yes, I understand
I just
that.
heard this, and I'm
Yes.
way over here.
I understand. No, ancient, we found marriage licenses of the ancient Jews in Egypt.
Really?
And in nearly every one of those marriage documents, the woman has a child. Because there was no point in marrying her if she wouldn't give you a child. And so you didn't marry her until after at least she was pregnant.
Okay, answer this, and you may not be able to. Okay, say for instance, she has a child, I'm nanny, and hopefully it's healthy and everything. Okay, so, oh, she's all excited, it's December 31st, and she's gonna get married the next day, and he says, so he leaves.
Yeah.
Do they do that too?
Yes, and that's why the betrothal was a legal process that had penalties to it.
What were the penalties?
The penalties could be very costly. For instance, the man would lose her entire betrothal. He would lose the entire the dowry that was put up. Yeah. Yeah.
But what happens to the child?
Then the family has to keep the
The
child.
child raises.
And of course, then depending upon your culture as to whether, if she's still in marriage when the child is born, whether you keep the child or you just give it to the gods. Infanticide in these ancient cultures was not uncommon at all, especially if it was a girl. See?
Here we go again, 4 women.
Yeah. Started at birth.
So if he leaves her, is she able to marry again?
Yes, she's there, but of course, she's damaged goods,
Yeah.
so she may have a harder time finding a man to marry
What
her.
about him? He's not damaged goods?
No, he's not damaged, but of course. But if, you see, even in the ancient, even in the ancient world, where the failure to have a child was heavily onus on the woman, there was a little suspicion that he couldn't have a child. He didn't have. He was married to this woman. He lived with this woman for X number of days, months, years, and they never had a child. Might not just be her fault.
50 years old, and he's still trying to make a child.
And so he was not completely off the hook either.
So could she leave him if he could impregnate her?
Well, that's another part of the issue. Precisely. That wasn't understood that clearly, but that's part of why this procedure develops. So that she's not stuck necessarily with a man who can't give her a child. There was a little suspicion that there was two things involved. And therefore, if a child wasn't being produced, the family of the woman might decide that they didn't. And remember now, in many of these ancient cultures, even into the Middle Ages and the Germanic tribes, the marriages were arranged. These people weren't picking out each other. The parents were picking.
So this was more common in what culture?
In biblical
In
times.
the Jews?
We don't know to what, it's not openly practiced among the Jews, but we've got these documents that indicate that the woman had a child when she got married.
Because a lot of the cultures, you had to go and pay for the woman.
Yes, in all the cultures, you had the dowry. You see, was a expense that the family could extract from the bride to be, from the groom to be. It was costly to be, and that's why in some cultures you had polygamy, because there were a lot of guys who couldn't afford a woman.
Well, see, I didn't think they allowed them to do all of what you're saying. I couldn't believe it. But say, for instance, like with Mary and Joseph, I know they weren't together like that, were they?
The biblical story insists that's the reason why the biblical story says
Well,
he didn't know her until after. It has to say that
that's why,
because ordinarily he would have.
well, that makes me wonder.
And that makes the whole story of Mary and Joseph that much more complicated.
Yes, it does.
Because since they were betrothed, there would have been nothing out of the ordinary.
No.
Had she turned up to not be having a period at least before they started living together. That wouldn't have been a disgrace. Now, remember, the Bible never talks about what we have always developed in the Christian faith of, quote, premarital sex.
Well, I guess.
The Bible only talks about fidelity in the marriage.
Fornication?
Fornication is simply the generic word for sexual immorality.
Yeah, but you're not living with someone.
It covers everything. Now, in English, in American English, the word fornication became the word for a person who was not married having sex, usually with somebody else who was also not married.
That's the way I understand it.
Yeah, but that's not the Bible
So
word.
you're saying that's not the biblical meaning?
That's not the Bible word. The Bible word that gets translated fornicate, and I think it was the English word even in 1611, was the generic term for sexual immorality, and it covered everything.
Even if you were married, you could fornicate.
Yes, even if you were married, you could fornicate because you were unfaithful.
You were immoral.
You were immoral.
Well, if you're together, like in this hand fasting, you're not
Yeah.
married, but that's not.
But you're engaged, you're betrothed. See, this isn't just open, premarital sex by two people who like each other and have gotten to bed with each other.
You're engaged.
This was a formal engagement. This was a document, and this was something done by the family.
I think it's just like it is today. We're gonna try not to call them. And then when they want that.
See, that's what
Yes.
How long do I want to get this little program?
Yes.
This is something.
And one,
It breaks my heart. It really does.
Yes.
I'm really desperate. I can't do that.
yes,
I find it hard to believe.
I know,
it's clear, you see,
I believe it.
that our modern perception of marital fidelity, of sexual purity, is not the historical picture of what us human beings were like.
No, we never changed.
And we've probably made a whole lot more over it than we should have, but that's another sermon. Well, as I said, the fundamental issue is you can make the case, especially because of Paul's remark in 1 Corinthians 6, that there is no such thing as premarital sex. When you have sex, you're married.
You're married.
Doesn't make any difference whether you got a license, whether you ever get a license, you're married. And any sex with anybody else besides that partner is their adultery. So the old comic stereotype about the shotgun wedding, they kissed and therefore they got to get married. Well, they had sex, they got to get married.
Yeah, you're gonna remember.
And one could argue that these ancient folk were a little bit more understanding of our human nature than us super moralists of the Victorian and subsequent Christian faith became.
Well, they were pretty smart. They waited a year and a day.
Yeah.
We should get pregnant.
Yeah, and you should get to know each other and be able to decide, is this something that we want to do, or is this something that's intolerable enough that we want to suffer all the consequences that are involved if we break up?
Now, we got to remember one thing. Back in those days, are they likely, or in some cultures today, do they choose the boy and choose the girl?
In most of these cases, these are arranged marriages. Yeah. Yeah.
So some of them may not have done anything.
No, right. Right. I did read a number of years ago about a custom in New England in the winters when the man would come to court the girl. They of course wanted to have some privacy, and of course the houses weren't that big, so there weren't that many places that you could be private and be warm. And so they actually adopted a bedboard that they would put in the middle of the bed, lengthwise. So the boy would be on one side, the girl would be on the other side. They could both be covered up and be warm, but they couldn't get too intimate with each other because there was a board in the way.
Like if that were gonna stop them.
In the bedboard. And now you're on the bedboard.
And of course, the reality is they couldn't get too intimate in those beds because you'd hear that throughout the house. So,
I'm sure they found a way.
have you ever slept on a straw mattress on a rope bed? You can't do anything quietly on a straw mattress on a rope bed. It just doesn't work. Back to the Wiccans. Here is one of their pledges, and they use the word pagan. I dedicate myself to channeling the spiritual energy of my inner self to help and to heal myself and others. Wicca is a pretty positive, benign group. I know that I'm part of the whole of nature. When I grow in understanding of the unity of nature, may I always walk in balance. May I use the force wisely and never use it for aggression nor for malevolent purposes. May I never direct it to curtail the free will of another. May I always be mindful that I create my own reality and that I have the power within me to create positivity in my life. Here's the ladies' prayer of Wicca. The 23rd Psalm. The earth is my mother. I shall not want. Her hand brings forth the green pastures. She tarries within the still waters. She leads me in the path of fruit in the fields of fruitfulness for my glory. Yea, and it's not even for her glory, because she may just be a figure of nature. Yea, as I walk through the summer of life unto death, I will not be afraid, for you are with me. You prepare a harvest for me. Bless my home with children. You fill me with milk and honey. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will nurture me all the days of my life, and I will become part of the earth forever. Now, is it difficult at all to see how a modern American, especially a modern American woman, would not find anything in this particularly objectionable, and could find in this considerable positive elements, especially if she'd grown up in a rigid, moralistic, domineering Christian family? It was pretty critical of people, pretty judgmental of people, even in her own church. That a lot of Sunday dinners fried the preacher. or the elder, or the Sunday school teacher, or one of the members in the church that came dressed inappropriately or overdressed or whatever it was they wanted to criticize that day.
Now, does this also have men in the organization?
Yes, there are men who have become involved in Wicca. Yeah, but this is, Wicca itself is far more feminist than some of these groups are. Because in its origin, it was very feminine oriented.
So that's why the men go and join it.
And that may be why some men try to go join it. Yeah. And they, of course, would be on the lookout for those men and be very cautious, if not pretty quickly antagonistic. Because they're clearly not living in this spirit of non-aggression. This group you see could be very anti-war, very social justice, very social welfare oriented, positively engaged in a lot of community activities and events. If they weren't being, quote, church run, and their involvement would be suspected, and they would have to face negative judgment and that kind of thing. If it was a more secular community event, they could participate in it with considerable involvement.
So you're saying the Democrats?
Could be, easily could be.
Well,
and as I said,
aren't they the ones that about 2 years ago wanted to make Halloween a national holiday?
Yes. Yes.
Saturdays?
Yes.
Every Saturday, not the 31st, but on Saturday.
Some of them are very open to these ancient celebrations.
Harvest.
Yeah, yeah. And they would see these positive powers, either natural or spiritual, be very open to natural healing, naturopathic medicine, that kind of thing. They would fit in, you see, with a lot of the modern American groups of all different kinds of persuasions. And there would be, with their religion, you see, there would be no conflict with their being involved in these other groups and events and activities, because they don't have an elaborate, exclusive theology that's going to conflict with some of these other ideals. They would be very comfortable. And because of that, they have had no trouble gaining significant popular recognition. As I mentioned in the beginning, they are recognized by the armed services as a legitimate religion. So if you join the armed services and are a practitioner of Wicca, you can insist that wherever you're stationed, that you have access to a counselor knowledgeable of Wicca, that you can fulfill your celebrations, that if there's nobody else in your unit that's a Wicca, you can do whatever it is you can do by yourself in terms of observing a holiday, having one of your meetings. And if there's 2 or 3 of you, you can have a legitimate coven, and they have to supply you the space, just like there's a chapel being built for the Christians and the synagogue for the Jews. They have to accept you.
So what about the Muslims?
The Muslims are, yeah. So there are Islamic chaplains in the armed services today.
That's just a shame though, when we have to go down because that's not called.
Sure.
Devil worship.
Well, it may not be devil.
What do you call it called?
The occult is simply a practitioner of these various magic procedures and ideas.
Well, I would think that would be like a cult or Satan.
Well, it wouldn't have to be.
It wouldn't have to be.
Now, the other most popularly recognized group that grows out of this same neo-pagan background is the Church of Satan. And they take,
Now, is he Satan?
and if you want to, we can look at him the week we come back, the last week we meet. Okay? Or would you rather look at some of these other new age groups, or you got somebody else like in mind, or you just want to have a party that Thursday night?
I'd like to go back and see what those people were doing years and years ago. This hand hasn't stopped me, though. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll
Yep.
just let you decide.
Okay.
Another shocker. Another shocker.
I think I really ought to throw Satanism at you. Just
He's really not Satan.
because the Church of Satan is just like Wicca. It's a totally modern creation, artificially developed in order for this guy, I think, as much as anything, just to stick it in the eye of the Christians that he was bothered with, or whatever. Okay.
These rituals,
Not in Wicca.
yeah, but I'm talking.
Well, yeah, some of these groups, you have sacrifices, and they have great rituals to go with that. And voodoo, which is an offshoot of this kind